Good morning. I'm Chris Hopwood. I have the pleasure of introducing our first master lecturer. Donna Bender was trained at Columbia, and she's currently the director of the Tulane University Counseling Services Center and a clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Tulane. I got to know Donna through the collaborative longitudinal personality disorder study and continued to follow and admire her work when she was on the DSM-5 work group for personality and personality disorders. Donna focused, I think, primarily on criterion A of that system, and I imagine that that concept will come up in the talk that you're about to see. Donna has a nice mix of research and clinical practice. She's a psychoanalyst, and she cares deeply about the heart of personality, which is what she'll talk about today. I'm her roadie, as you can tell by my manner of dress, so I brought all of the equipment that you see up on the stage this morning. Please join me in welcoming Donna Bender.
Thanks a lot, Chris. The other groupies are out there. I think you need to manage them a little bit. So I am so grateful and honored to be here today to speak in celebration of Paul Lerner. And thank you so much for joining me in taking a little time to consider, in fact, how personality is the heart of the matter. So I want us to start a little bit by thinking about New Orleans. You're here in New Orleans, and you have ideas about what New Orleans is all about, I'm sure. And New Orleans, you know about the food. And New Orleans, you also know, is a city of music. And not just jazz music, all sorts of music. And this year, in fact, at Jazz Fest, the Rolling Stones are the headliners. So I wanted to let you know that, kind of in keeping with the spirit of the music, I have peppered my talk today with some music references. And I've done this for maybe 3 reasons. The first reason is they stand to punctuate some of the ideas that I will be talking about. Second reason is I'm hoping this little trivia quiz that I've sort of put through here will be more alluring than your smartphones. And the third reason is, in fact, that I think in this day and age, a big part of the mental health field has ceded some very fundamental psychological ideas to the songwriters, to the poets, to the English departments, and to the journalists. So, the other thing about New Orleans, you know, besides the music, along with the music, it's a very participatory city. And so somebody starts playing some music on the sidewalk, people start getting up to dance. You're at a Mardi Gras parade, and all of a sudden you're out in the street with the 610 Stompers doing a line dance. Now, I'm not going to make you dance, but I do have some stuff in here that I would like to participate with you, okay? So hope you'll join me in that. And in that spirit, take a look. I'd like you to call to mind John Lennon. Okay, so depending upon how old you are, you may remember John when he was part of Beatlemania. You may think about John and his songs he did with Paul McCartney. You might think about John when he was with Yoko. You might remember when he was shot. Or you might be so young that you don't know from John Lennon. But keep that image for just a second. All right, now let's let John go. Let's shift. Think about somebody who's very important to you. Think about somebody you care about a lot. Think about what they mean to you. Think about how they make you a better person. Think about what's important to them. Think about how your life is better because of what they bring to it. Okay. Heart of the matter number 1. How we think about ourselves and ourselves in relation to other people is really the core of who we are, is really central to our personalities, and really drives how we are in the world and how we do in life. Okay, so not everybody thinks about that when they're doing their work. So, Don Henley walks into a mental health clinician's office. Clinician says, "Well, Mr. Henley, what brings you in today?" Don says, "These times are so uncertain. There's a yearning undefined, people filled with rage." Clinician says, "Oh, you sound hopeless. In the last month, have you lost interest in things that you enjoy?" Don says, "We all need a little tenderness. How can love survive in such a graceless age?" Clinician says, "Have you had thoughts about death?" Don says, "The trust and self-assurance that lead to happiness, they're the very things we kill, I guess." "How have you been feeling about yourself?" "Oh, pride and competition cannot fill these empty arms. And the work I put between us, you know, it doesn't keep me warm. Feels guilty." "Have you had problems concentrating?" "The more I know, the less I understand. All the things I thought I knew, I'm learning again. I've been trying to get down to the heart of the matter. Cognitive impairment and ruminations." Mr. Henley, have you had these experiences nearly every day for the last 2 weeks? Huh? Yeah, I guess. Well, I'd like to tell you that you have major depressive disorder, and I would like to get you set up with a prescription. "No, man, I'm not into that stuff." "Well, listen, Glenn sent me here because I had a breakup with my fiance. And do you have anything to tell me that's of any use at all?" Personality issues. So I think you see the point that I'm trying to make. I think that too often these days, the establishment is encouraging people to really not listen, to really have particularly narrow lenses through which we encounter the people we're trying to help. And so I challenge us today to think about what is the data that we need to be gathering from the people we're trying to help. Now, Paul Lerner, who is a rock star, because who but a rock star would name one of his papers after red beavers? That's really awesome. Has a lot to say about these sorts of things, and I quote him: "The ultimate purpose of an assessment is not the achieving of a diagnosis and the assigning of a diagnostic label. Instead, many of us are appreciating that one assesses with the intent of understanding the other in his or her totality, complexity, and uniqueness, so that such an understanding can then be used as a basis for making decisions and suggesting interventions that will be beneficial to that individual." Heart of the matter number 2. People need to tell their stories and have them heard and understood. I think there is actually today a real identity hunger. People are looking constantly to tell their stories on social media, with pictures, on 23andMe, is that what it's called? People are getting genetic testing to try to find out, is there some backstory to their lives? all right? This is a basic human need. And we sometimes act like, clinically, we don't really know this. So again, turn to Paul Lerner and his brother Howard about this whole need we have to diagnose people. They say the implicit premise that each diagnosis signifies a separate and distinct disturbance is antithetical to the clinician who views external expressions, symptoms, complaints, behaviors, as arising from a common internal source. Heart of the matter number 3 that I put to you today is that these symptom disorders that we get so caught up in have to arise from the substrate of personality. They don't exist as these separate things, and we act like they do. But they're in the context. You all are personality experts. You know this, but the world doesn't act this way. And the other thing that many of us know is that each clinical encounter is going to be filtered through the patient's pre-existing ideas about how they are and how other people are and how the world works. And if you don't take this data into consideration, then I'm not so sure that we're doing our jobs. Okay, so a lot of you, as Chris mentioned, know about my work on the DSM-5 and the level of personality functioning scale. So speaking of stories, since I have you as a captive audience, I get to tell you some bits about my story today and how I ended up working on the DSM-5. So, 1991, my first week in my doctoral program at Columbia, I go stomping into Barry Farber, the chair's office. I said, hey, I want to get out in front of this dissertation thing. You got any research going on? He says, well, yeah. As a matter of fact, I do. I'm working with my colleague, Jesse Geller, up at Yale, and we're studying these representations of significant others, particularly therapists, parents. Sound interesting? I'm like, yeah, sure. So I got on board, and this was a really cool part of life. One Friday a month, we got in the car, drove to Yale, blaring music, singing along. This was a cool advisor to have in grad school. And you can see how it's inspired my talk today. Barry went on to write a book about the wisdom of rock and roll lyrics and how psychologically sophisticated they can be. So anyway, we were in this group. Yale, I made this name up. We didn't really have a name. So it was 2 professors and a group of students. And so this was really entering the part of a clinical and empirical tradition that had been going on for quite a while already, because as a lot of you know, Sid Blatt was also at Yale. And so this was really walking around in that kind of terrain. So just to give you some background about this stuff that I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with, probably more so than me. This isn't just a thing that's been researched for a few decades. I think this has been going on. I mean, Freud started talking about it. If you're putting aside the literature, the Bible, everything, Freud started talking about it. You just can name Abraham, all the theorists and all the clinicians and all the writers and all the researchers that have been talking about mental representations and how it is such a fundamental part of who we are. So the basic idea is that we are developmentally primed, that these are innate processes, that we form these mental models about people as we grow by interacting with our environment, right? It's pretty simple. And so there's this innate trajectory right? I don't think that's too hard to buy. So if this goes well, your internal life is rich, complex, multifaceted. You have very productive working models of other people that you can use to figure out how to be. Things don't go so well, you don't have this. You have a lot of disruptions, and it causes you to have some problems in the world, right? So, and of course, as I mentioned before, whatever your pre-existing working models are, your schemas, whatever, they come into play in treatment. Okay, so we worked on this a number of years, and I ended up using some of these measures in the data that I gathered for my dissertation. So let me talk to you a minute or two about the measures that we were using. So the conceptual level scale was one of the Blatt measures, and again, it's a unitary dimension, and it's 5 levels. Does that sound familiar? And it's, again, predicated on the notion that the internal world becomes developmentally more elaborated. And if things go wrong, then the attributes of your internal world exist in a more basic, more primitive, you think about people in terms of, do they meet my needs or not? You really don't think about who they are, how they're different from you, what their perspectives are. So that's the bottom. All the way up through, you have a fully elaborated. So when you were thinking about that important person earlier, that was more likely to be a very complicated, rich, multi-layered set of images, emotions, thoughts, than maybe John Lennon. Maybe you really love John Lennon, I don't know, but so that's the basic idea. So that it's one dimension that Sid Blatt had formed to describe this phenomenon. So another measure that we were working on, our group, was called the Thematic Patterning Scale of Object Representations. And so this was looking for themes in the representations, right? So we were looking for things. So there are eight dimensions in all. I used 3 of them in this study. So we would apply these, back it up for a second. We would apply these are content analyses measures, to descriptions of mother, father, self, and therapist. Okay, so this is what we were analyzing. This was our data for these 2 measures. So the 3 dimensions were gratification, frustration. Again, it's fairly self-apparent. Are they able to interact with you in a way that meets your needs or not? Do you see the person as a unique, separate individual? And de-illusionment was a really cool dimension because it's not disillusionment. De-illusionment, to get a high score on that, means that you are capable of really wrestling with the good stuff and the disappointing stuff about the other and come to some kind of a reconciliation about how that person is. And people who don't have this capacity and who score very low on this are the kind of people who sort of see things black and white. I really hate my father. He's the worst person I've ever known. My mother is an absolute saint, period. Things like that. Okay, so we gathered this data using another instrument, a self-report instrument called the Therapist Representation Inventory. And this is an instrument that was designed to ask people, patients, about their experiences in between therapy sessions, okay? And I'll give you more detail on that one in a little bit, but this is how we gathered the data. So in the clinic at Columbia, we would have people fill these out after 4 or 5 sessions, and then we'd have them fill it out again for 4 to 6 months into treatment. Okay, so let me just give you some examples of some of the findings we came up with. Okay, we found out that the conceptual levels of all 4 objects, mother, father, self, and therapist, were highly correlated. That shouldn't be a surprise because, again, these are capacities that you develop developmentally, right? It's a developmental trajectory, and it's unlikely that you would be able to have a very sophisticated, rich, elaborated view of one object, but then another object is really far down, primitive at the bottom. I'm planting some seeds here for a little bit later in case you're not picking this up. So we found that higher conceptual levels, and this again, is on the Blatt scale, were associated with being able to see the therapist as a unique, potentially helpful individual, while also being able to tolerate the flaws and disappointments. This is also the thematic patterning scale. The mother and the father descriptions were significantly linked to overall functioning. We measured that with the GAF. There were some other measures here. I measured attachment. I measured character pathology with the Milan at this point. So, and the character pathology dimensions, we found some interesting things. So the higher the dimension of borderline, the lower the conceptual level of mother. The higher the dimension of paranoia, the lower the conceptual level of father and therapist. Other things were people who remain preoccupied with negative aspects of therapy in between sessions didn't do so well. People who are continuing to mentally process, think about how they work with their therapist in between sessions did better. And over the course of 4 to 6 months, the therapist representation changed as it got integrated more into the internal world of the patient, but the mother, father, and self did not, which shouldn't be a surprise because these are long-standing schemas. Okay, so finished up at Columbia, got my degree, went on my way. Just so happened there was somebody on my dissertation committee who knew Andy Skodel, who of course was one of the PIs on the collaborative study. And so I hit the jackpot. I got a job right out of grad school working on one of the most landmark studies that has been done to date on personality disorders. So on the road again, here we go, because then we're driving to Yale, we're driving to Brown, we're driving to Harvard. We had Les flying in, first from Vanderbilt and then Texas A&M. And so for those of you not familiar with the study, we followed over 700 people for 10 years, measuring them on all sorts of indicators. And we had a complicated way of assigning them to diagnostic groups because there's a lot of comorbidity, as you know, amongst PDs when you use a category. So the groups were obsessive compulsive personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, schizotypal, and then the comparison group was major depressive disorder with no PD. Now, I was in charge of the Columbia site of finding those people, the MDD ones. That was the hardest group to populate, I will tell you. And I will also tell you that they were allowed to have some personality stuff, right? So none of them were crystal clean on the personality stuff. It was far enough below threshold to represent a difference. But this is what I'm talking about. Symptom disorders in the middle of personality. Okay. So one of the studies that I was able to be involved with this population was to take the therapist representation inventory that I mentioned a minute ago and to have some of these people participate and tell us about how they think about their therapists. So we did this study at the Columbia and Yale sites. So the therapist representation inventory has several different components to it. There's a self-reported outcome measure. There's a circumstances and characteristics part of the instrument that ask people, under what circumstances do you think about your therapist? How often do you think about your therapist? When you think about your therapist, how long do you think about your therapist? And what's that like? So then there's the therapist involvement scale. When you think about your therapist, what specifically are you thinking about? The therapist embodiment scale, when you think about your therapist, do you picture them? Do you imagine their voice? Do you think about what it smells like in their office? So sensory modalities. And then again, this has the open-ended description. Please describe your therapist, take 5 minutes. So 200 of our CLIPS participants joined us in this. Now, the therapist involvement scale factor analyzes, I think there's 33 items on it. It factor analyzes into 6 factors: sexual and aggressive involvement, wish for reciprocity, that's wanting to get to know the therapist better, wishing you could have lunch with them, things like that. Continuing the therapeutic dialogue, items like I try to solve problems the way my therapist and I talk about them. When I'm having a problem, I work it out with my therapist in mind. Failure of benign internalization. This is really having trouble utilizing the therapy in a helpful way. Items like I don't think therapy will have a lasting effect, and I wish I had a different therapist. Effort to create an introject, again, to keep it alive so that it's helpful to you in between sessions. Looking for your therapist out in a crowd. Do you daydream about your therapist? And mourning. So there's something about the separation in between sessions that makes you miss your therapist or think about calling your therapist. Okay, that just gives you a flavor of that part of the instrument. Okay, this is where we get back to the audience participation. So these are, remember the 5 groups, right? So there is obsessive compulsive, avoidant, borderline, schizotypal, and the depressed folks, right? So, and these are the highest mean items from the TIS, okay? So I'm gonna ask you, which group do you think most strongly endorsed, I hope I never have to be in therapy again? What do you think? Anybody wanna guess? Avoidant? Any other guesses? Paranoid. Sorry? Paranoid. Well, paranoid's not one of the groups, but that makes sense. Okay, I'll tell you, the ones who hope they never had to be in therapy again, that depressed group. Okay, I would like my therapist to be proud of me. Good guess. The borderline group. Now this next one had equal hits for 2 groups. I try to solve problems the way my therapist and I worked on them in psychotherapy. Yeah, and avoidant, right? Okay, and the last one, I look forward to returning to sessions with my therapist. There's only one left, folks. There it is. Okay, now remember those descriptions. Take 5 minutes to describe your therapist, right? So all of these patients filled that out. So now I have some descriptions for you. 3 descriptions, and I want you to tell me which diagnostic group you think this person came from. Okay. It's one of the best, most considerate, pretty, and intelligent therapists I have ever had in my life. I know if she were my wife, I could accomplish anything, climb heights, and be a success in life. I love her in my heart and my soul, and this will never change. She will always be in my soul and thoughts. I will miss her very much, as she was not overly critical and at the same time objective. This is not an obsession, but a mental observation. All right, so which group do you think? Borderline? Yeah. Schizotypal. He's highly intelligent, kind, caring, loving. I love to hear his voice. He relaxes and soothes me with it. There is so much to say about him. I don't know how to continue. Anyway, I love to see him. I wish we could hang out together. He's great. He's special to me in many ways. He seems to say all the right things and seems to know me very, very well, and he understands me to the point where I think and feel he can see right through me. Schizotypal. Very beautiful and attractive in a sense that I yearn to have a sexual relationship with her. She's very smart and educated. She knows what she wants out of life, and I wish I were working for her. I could take her out to the movies and dinner. She turns me on, and I desperately want to make love to her eternally. She's my life, and knowing she doesn't feel the same, I live in dreams. Schizotypal. See where I'm going with this? All right, so here's the DSM-4, DSM-5, Section 2 schizotypal criteria. Who would have us think that these people are weirdos who cannot be around other people and all they think about is how scary other people are? Okay? Does that serve us well in working with these people? I don't think so. It's not getting to the heart of the matter. Okay. So there was another project we worked on also at our Analytic Institute looking at the fate of representations of the therapist post-termination. That was some interesting work as well. That work then led me to the opportunity to be on the DSM-5 Personality and Personality Disorders Work Group. And I am grateful for that opportunity. But if you see the lyrics that I have quoted up here, you can see what that was like. And I believe Les Morey expounded upon the experience in this space several years ago, more eloquently than I ever will. So, yes, we worked on the DSM-5. We were given the charge of coming up with a dimensional system to take the place of the categorical PD system, right? You all know that. So we set about our work. Now you have part of my story to see where I was coming from when I got to this assignment. I'm coming from the tradition of Sid Blatt. I'm coming from the tradition of internalized object relations, right? Pretty obvious. Okay, going back to the Lerners. We are supportive of attempts to create a diagnostic classification system that reflects something essential about human nature and also serves clinical purposes. And so I saw this as an opportunity to try to do something to put in the manual a piece that would get people asking better questions, that it would motivate people to allow their patients to tell their stories, right? Not check, 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 check. And to listen in the kinds of ways that are most meaningful and most fundamental and most profound about what it means to be human and what these folks are bringing to us for our help. Okay, so these are just some of the main ideas to recap again. There's a long empirical basis for thinking about personality functioning. There is a long empirical, theoretical, clinical basis for the notion that mental representations of self and self in relation to others are linked to really basic capacities and drive overall life functioning, really. These things vary dimensionally, and reliable ratings can be made on a number of self-other constructs, right? So this is kind of what we went into this with. Chris Hopwood did a paper demonstrating that the system really needed a severity dimension, and that, in fact, that was so strongly predictive of psychopathology over and above anything that the categories had to offer. Okay, so we set about doing a literature review, and some of you may know these papers. We gathered up clinician-administered measures that had these kind of themes in them, and we kept dimensions that showed reliability equal to or greater than 0.75. And so this is the building of the level of personality functioning scale that many of you know about, many of you are doing research on. So a couple of examples of the measures that we looked at the research. Well, again, it was the Blatt measures. The scores had a number of measures that were relevant. The Fonagy reflective functioning. This is the ability to mentalize is really, really at the heart of all of this. Okay, so Les Morey is truly a rock star. He's literally a rock star, as you can see here. So Les took these things that we gathered in the Lit Review. He pulled together data on 3,000 patients, and he demonstrated that, in fact, there is a core self-other dimension, one dimension, at the heart of personality functioning. So, to characterize that dimension, we chose the components of identity, self-direction, empathy, and intimacy. Now, I could put up like the level of personality functioning scale, and as Les said, there's probably too many words in it, and it's hard to look at, and whatever. Let me boil it down for you. Okay, back to basics. What we're trying to say here, and I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this is the only thing in the entire DSM that actually says what it looks like to function well, right? Any other thing is, okay, well, if you don't have it, we don't talk about it, right? You either have it or you don't have it. But it doesn't say this is what it looks like to be a fully functioning individual. Nowhere, except here, okay? So the level of personality functioning scale, which does run into high functioning, healthy level, says that every single solitary human being, if they're doing well, has a positive sense of themselves as unique and valued. They have a rich, accessible, and sufficiently regulated emotional life. They can reflect on and make meaning of their experiences. They're able to do the stuff of their life, set goals, they do it effectively, they do it ethically, and they're able to have fulfilling and reciprocal relationships, right? So why is this important? Because, again, it links to capacities that we all have, ideally, and we need to have. What are those capacities? Well, regulating your self-esteem without excessive feedback. That's an issue in today's society, if you haven't noticed. The ability to name, tolerate, and use your emotions in constructive ways. Being able to productively self-reflect, know your own mind, and accurately sort of intuit what somebody else is going through, right? You need to be able to then appreciate that somebody might have a different perspective from you. Man, is that tough these days. Have constructive and pro-social standards to use to pursue your goals. And again, those close relationships are fundamental. So these are universal human capacities. All right, so as I said, there are 5 levels to this scale. We had to, of course, run it into psychopathology because that was our job. All right. You all heard what happened. The APA, in their infinite wisdom, would not get off the field. And so we ended up in Section 3 of the manual. Now, Section 3 of the manual, you can use this model. You can use it. It doesn't say you can't use it. It's an alternative model. So that's where it is. All right. I want to sort of bring this home now by sharing a case with you. Okay. Ms. A. And this was a case, actually, of a student who came into our clinic at Tulane. And so I had the opportunity to supervise one of our psychologists on her work with this student. So Ms. A is a 19-year-old college sophomore, and she came in on an urgent walk-in appointment, citing emotional distress due to being cut from the basketball team. She maintained that this was a result of discrimination against her because she has acne. She stated that her whole life revolves around basketball, so being cut from the team was absolutely devastating for her. She also reported that she was committing to fighting the university on this decision. So the therapist recommended coming back for a follow-up and she said she couldn't really schedule at that point, but she'd call back. She didn't call back. 2 weeks later, she walked in again for an urgent session, saw a different therapist, Dr. R. She said things had gotten worse, her academics were suffering, and she had situational depression. So she requested starting therapy and was scheduled with an intake with Dr. R. So during the intake, Ms. A explained that her dermatology appointments conflicted with basketball practice and that her coaches really should just be okay with her doing that and not coming to practice. Because really, this is a very, very important medical issue. She said the coaches were really hung up on image, and even though she knows she is super cute in every way, she felt like she was, quote, shunned by the athletics department because of her skin issues. She said again that basketball is at the center of her identity, and she uses her high status as a star player for community and charity work. She described herself prior to this incident as 100% social and outgoing. Then she no-showed for her next appointment. When she came in next, she said she was feeling somewhat better. Her parents had gone to the vice president of the university. An investigation had been launched, and she was provisionally reinstated on the team. Over the next several sessions, she continued to be fixated on how she was being treated unfairly. Dr. R worked very hard to manage her own reactions to Ms. A's haughtiness and treating really Dr. R like a servant or a piece of furniture. During the course of the sessions, it became apparent that in spite of Ms. A's presentation that she was a basketball star who could use her celebrity in the community, in fact, she had not played one league game since coming to the university. After missing another series of sessions, Ms. A returned and reported that she had again been cut from the team, and she was sure her teammates were making fun of her behind her back, and she felt like her safety was in fact threatened at this point. Her sessions continued to be focused on the injustices of the situation, demands for advice on whether she should withdraw or transfer, and no reflection whatsoever on alternative perspectives or the broader role that this experience might have for her in her life. She expressed considerable worry that she would not be able to regain her charisma. In one session, she reported that the dean agreed to erase her grades from the prior semester. She brought up the clinic's 12-session limit and said that she is going to ask the VP of the university to tell the clinic director to make an exception because of how bad her situation is. She then talked further about her victimization by the university. Ms. A said she would plan to go abroad, but her parents would continue to fight all of this and work on her behalf because of what was done to her. Dr. R tried very hard to work around allowing herself to gain to work with the student to allow herself to gain some of the situational understanding, but she couldn't move on. Ms. A said, "This is just all talk." She said thinking about things from another perspective just wasn't useful. She complained that not enough importance was being placed on her case and that being part of the biggest scandal in college athletics history was too hard to move on from. Okay, so that's Ms. A. What I want to do now is apply the level of personality functioning scale. Yes, we'll score it. But then I want to show you why the scale captures really essential clinical information. All right, so I'd put this one, I don't know where y'all put it, I put it at a level 2. And these are actually all the words that define level 2. So in terms of identity, this girl is very outwardly focused. She needs the adoration. She has vulnerable self-esteem. She thinks she's great. And we could tell that threats to her self-esteem engendered strong emotions. She wasn't able to really own those emotions for herself, but clearly she was enraged. And clearly she felt ashamed of herself because of things that had happened to her. Setting goals for external approval, needing to be special, not able to reflect on her internal experience, hyper-attuned to what others think of her, self-referential, can't really no interest in what other people's experiences are, and unrealistic appraisal of her own effect. She was not a superstar. Her connections did seem largely superficial. She didn't talk about having any good friends, any supportive relationships on campus. She was really enraged that Dr. R was really not seeming to understand how special she was and how devastating this whole experience was. And she, again, not interested in what's going on with other people. Okay, so that's where we would put her, where I would rate her on the level personality functioning scale. All right, so let's take this now to the clinic, to the work. So Dr. R brought this case to me because, frankly, she didn't know what the heck to do with it anymore. She was so frustrated because she wasn't getting anywhere with this patient. So the patient, as you could hear, was so self-referential. Dr. R felt like a piece of furniture because this is a person who really can't tolerate an alternative point of view. In Paul Lerner's paper about the red beavers patient, he sat with that patient for 9 months while she read a journal that she had written about the experiences she had gone through in her life. Paul Lerner had to tolerate that. That's what we have to do with patients who are impaired in these capacities. That's why this information is so important. Dr. R, and this happens too, so when the patient's level of functioning is low, you often can't think straight in the room. They drag your level of mentalizing down too. And this is what Dr. R was feeling like. She didn't know what the heck to do. She didn't know how the heck to think about this case in the room because it was just this barrage. At the same time, these are also trends that draw you into trying to fix it, right? Ms. A, you need to change your point of view. There's something to be learned here. Well, that's all talk, Ms. A said. So, as I said, Dr. R was kind of at her wit's end when she brought this case to me. So she and I talked about it over a period of time, and some of the things we learned, again, using this basic kind of self-other model, I encouraged her to think about how she feels as a therapist, how frustrated she is data. That's what it's like to be that patient. So impotent, so frustrated. The world's not going her way. I also invited her to think about how this patient really can't tolerate another perspective, another point of view at this point, and so had her back away from suggesting interventions, from trying to get the patient to do mindfulness to calm down. The patient didn't want to do mindfulness. And her intervention shifted to, gee, it must be really hard. My gosh, I can hear how frustrated you are, right? Things like that, just mirroring. But if you don't have this perspective, you're not thinking about it in this way, and you're gonna try to get this patient to do what you need her to do. You'll get nowhere. So she also had to realign what she could get accomplished in the short-term treatment. This is not a person, and she managed to get the student calmed down once she shifted her stance, but this was a long-term treatment. So if this student engages in long-term treatment, which once she left us, we weren't quite sure what was going to happen. She was going abroad anyway. The treatment should really focus on helping this student with her mentalizing function, inviting her to explore her inner life and the disavowed parts of herself. Okay, so that's a case example, kind of bringing home to the heart of the matter what I think really is the spirit of the level of personality functioning scale, and is really what I personally was trying to get accomplished in my work with the DSM. Okay, recently I was invited by the Journal of Personality Assessment to write a commentary. And in that commentary, I raised the idea that a number of people support that in fact there's a G factor running through all of psychopathology. But I suggest that that G factor, general factor, is a P factor, a personality factor. And I suggest that perhaps that personality factor can be characterized through the very human attributes of identity, self-direction, empathy, and intimacy. And in conclusion, I submit to you that you all are especially prepared to lead the way in taking the work to the heart of the matter. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering to what extent you would consider her interpersonal context. I mean, this sounds like a young woman who's really probably pretty indulged by her parents and kind of maybe intensifying some of these feelings that she might have been bringing to therapy.
Yeah, no question. No question, and I think that speaks directly to the goal here. Really is to learn about the totality, to the extent that we can, of the individual. Not only their internal lives, but their interpersonal lives are absolutely crucial in knowing about that. And yes, she was being totally overindulged. The parents were absolutely as entitled as she was, and you're right. No question. And in a long-term therapy, we would want to work on that. Yeah. Anything else? All right, thank you all. Have fun in New Orleans.